Welcome everyone who's joining. I'm seeing the numbers tick up as folks come into the meeting. We're delighted to have you here. I'll just wait a couple of minutes while the room keeps filling. All right, looks like we reached a good pause moment. Let me start out and introduce myself. My name is Cindy Clark. I'm one of the co-executive directors for AWID. AWID's a global feminist membership organization, and for close to 20 years now, one of our priorities has been research and advocacy on resourcing trends impacting women's rights and feminist organizations. So from the outset of that work, it was very clear that institutional support was a major game changer for these organizations and also quite elusive. So I'm really thrilled and excited to be able to moderate the conversation today. I'm looking forward to it. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. We do have interpretation. And I know there will be a slide with a reminder of how to access the interpretation. You should see a little globe at the bottom of your Zoom. And you can select your preferred language there. The session is being recorded. We are going to try to make it as much of a conversation as possible. So our speakers are exploring different dimensions of the question around institutional support for local women's organizations. Please do include any questions that you have along the way in the chat box. We will do our best when we have time at the end of the conversation to address those. All right, and then we have a fabulous lineup. I hope you will walk away from the session today wondering why you haven't done more institutional funding sooner. Or if you're not a funder, you're going to walk away with a very compelling case that you can use with others. So not to worry, there's lots of research methods, experience here to support you take it forward. It is possible. And it's really critical to achieve the kind of results that we all want to see. So I'm excited the way this conversation can show how the crisis of the COVID pandemic really catalyzed a different, and I would say, more effective way of working that can and should be our standard practice. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to our colleague Henriette Geiger, who is the Director for People and Peace at the European Commission Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development. Henriette, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Cindy. I hope you can hear me all right. Let me start by saying that I'm very happy to be able to join you today. To join you today at this special event, which tackles the important issue of funding women's organizations, and more specifically, to tackle the issue of core funding, which can be used in a flexible manner to cover evolving priorities and needs. The need for increased funding for women's organizations and feminist movements is now more relevant than ever. 25 years ago, the international community adopted the Beijing Declaration and its action platform. While there has been some progress, it has been uneven, to say the least, and gender inequality continues to hold women back everywhere around the globe, depriving them of human rights and equal opportunities. Also, past achievements are increasingly under threat, and more so now as gender inequality as well as gender-based violence are exacerbated by the health, social, and economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are all aware of the key role played by women's organizations in delivering services, key services within their communities, and in having women and girls' voices heard. And this is more needed than ever. Women's and girls' insight and experience are key. They are eyes and ears on the ground, and they are important for policy making, for peace processes, for national and local processes, and also internationally. Women have been demanding justice and accountability increasingly in every part of the world, be it in Belarus, Sudan, or Brazil. Women are driving forces of protest movements, and they are the ones who feel inequalities the most, and they are the ones who stand up to ask for justice. With our current crisis, many organizations saw themselves confronted with unforeseen challenges. The access to beneficiaries has been made very difficult. A new virtual world had to be embraced. Contingency plans had to be made basically in no time, and staff well-being had to be ensured. And the crisis confirmed once more the need for access to flexible funding, to be able to adapt and respond swiftly to the new needs. Now, you know that the EU is a large bureaucracy, and we don't have the reputation of being always the most flexible. We have very stringent rules and procedures. It is therefore of key importance to partner with those organizations that can provide this flexible support. Partners which are close to grassroots organizations, partners who have the right tools in their toolbox, and partners who can accompany the organizations all along the way. So what we're trying to do typically is to work with sub-granting that will allow us to reach really grassroots organizations while still paying tribute to our rules. Now, the EU UN Spotlight Initiative is dedicating an important part of its support to the women's movement globally, women's rights and feminist organizations. The initiative helps them build capacity to carry out advocacy work whilst protecting themselves, for example, by networking more efficiently with others. In the last year, the Spotlight Initiative has been very swift to react to the crisis. And in the past month, more than 21 million euros of Spotlight funds have been redirected to address violence against women and girls, which has been on a dramatic increase due to the COVID. Special efforts have been made to boost prevention measures and reinforce services using innovative approaches such as digitalized legal services, hotlines, digital platforms, mobile clinics. Critical funding was also channeled to civil society, so they could continue to operate effectively and respond rapidly and safely whilst delivering frontline services to women and girls. In this respect, I'm truly proud of the work done in partnership with the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund and the Fund to End Violence Against Women and Girls. In no time at all, the Fund to End Violence Against Women and Girls managed to adapt their work to the crisis and provide rapid support to 44 women's and grassroots organizations, providing them with a much needed lifeline. In no time at all, the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund offered dedicated funding streams to institutional support in its cause. These are just two examples of how flexible funding can be provided. I know that there are other good examples, but we don't have the time to go into this right now. So I'm taking this opportunity to call on all partners, donors and funders to be innovative and creative when providing funding to grassroots organizations. We need to do this if we want to build a sustainable women's movement. To end, I would like to highlight that in the new EU's Gender Action Plan 3, we have committed to increase the funding to women's organizations and intensify dialogue and cooperation, because we feel that this is a much needed element for sustainable development cooperation in the future. I will leave you here, as I know there are many more speakers on the menu this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Henriette, for that really helpful and inspiring introduction to the conversation. Picking up on those themes of flexibility, adaptiveness, innovation in the interests of sustainable women's movements is a great starting point for the discussion. So we're going to move now to what we know and what the data is telling us about funding for gender equality and local women's organizations in conflict and crisis settings. Lisa Williams, so we are all forever indebted to the OECD DAC GenderNet and the incredible data that you all marshal and process and make sense of to give us some sense of what's going on. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So it's wonderful to be here today. And I just want to start by saying thank you to the organizers, right? It's excellent to be organizing with UN Women today and with the EU as well. And want to commend the Spotlight Initiative and the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund for all the great work on supporting women's rights organizations around the world. Thank you for your recognition as well for the work that we do to try to make sure that we have the ability to reflect some of the data about what's happening in this space. This is an extremely strategic moment where we have a lot of momentum to work on this agenda together, given the 20th anniversary of 1325, but also given this moment that we have to think about support for women's rights organizations more effectively together today. So what I would like to do too is to just make sure that everyone realizes we are able to go into the data on ODA, and we released last week our most recent figures on official development assistance to gender equality across donor agencies. And I wanted to recognize two colleagues that are on the line, Jenny Hedman, who's our lead on financing for gender equality issues with ODA and beyond ODA, who does the work on this type of analysis for us, and Charlotte Gomez as well, who's helped to prepare for today and leads in my team on women's economic empowerment issues and conflict and fragility as well, and gender equality. We work within the GenderNet, the DAC network on gender equality, and the International Network on Conflict and Fragility as two key fora for really speaking to these issues of financing for gender equality in fragile and conflict affected contexts. And at this time, we've been looking quite closely at what's happening, obviously, in the COVID recovery context. And we produced a piece in the fall that really looks at the issues of women and girls and how we can increase our financing to women's rights organizations and more local organizations in this effort, as we really try to have a much more sincere recovery, and refers to some of the issues that have already been raised about the notion of flexibility and the need to really look at how our practices can be improved to be more supportive in the future. You mentioned at the very top that we're working on institutional arrangements, and that there had been a piece in 2016 done by our team on how to improve some of the guidance around supporting institutional arrangements to be able to invest more effectively. But let me take you through some of the numbers. So the overall data on financing for gender equality is at about 45% of ODA today. So we're at this sort of overall percentage. You can see here, these graphs are sometimes these figures are a little bit hard to follow at times, but this one I think you can see relatively well, that essentially we are at an all-time high of investments in gender equality in terms of official development assistance. So bilateral allocable aid, we say, for gender equality. This is good news, but it could be better. So overall, the picture could be better, and we're working to try to give more detail to what's possible in this space. 5% of this is dedicated to gender equality in the agencies, and the rest is actually integrated. So now I'll turn, I think, to some of the overall data in fragile and conflict affected settings. And I think we can flip the slide on to the next one. Official development assistance for gender equality and women's empowerment is steadily increasing with OECD DAC members, contributing $53 billion of aid overall, as I just said a moment ago. In the 57 countries and territories that are considered fragile contexts by the OECD, ODA is the second most important source of external finance after remittances. So this is to give you a sense of sort of the overall context. The OECD data now shows that total bilateral aid to gender equality in fragile contexts has also been steadily rising over the past decade, reaching about $20.6 billion in 2019. However, only $2.7 billion was dedicated to gender equality as a principal objective of the program, corresponding to 5% of bilateral aid to fragile contexts. So it's important to understand that while there are rising figures, there's a lot more that can actually be done. I'd like to highlight now some of the data specifically to financing on women's organizations and institutions. I think we could go to the next slide. This is where we have a lot of work to do. So we collect these data using a dedicated statistical code, which helps us to identify funding for women's rights organizations. And there are other governance issues that come into this particular code in our creditor reporting system. And it allows us to look at government lift, so what's happening at the national level as well in terms of funding. But it really does give us a better sense of what kinds of organizations and kind of funding is coming into organizations. In 2019, DAC donors committed $129 million to women's rights organizations and institutions in fragile contexts. This represents only close to about 1% of gender equality focused aid to fragile contexts. So there is quite a bit more that can be done. The evolution since 2010 shows that funding for women's rights organizations in fragile contexts is very volatile, but still on an upward trend. And DAC members that commit most funding to women's organizations in fragile contexts are Canada at 56 million, the Netherlands at 24 million, Norway at 14 million, Sweden at 13 million, the EU at 10 million, and Spain at 10 million as well. And you can see this on the slide. The women's organizations that receive the largest amounts of funding are based in the following countries: Uganda, DRC, Myanmar, Pakistan, Tanzania, Kenya, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and South Sudan. And we can give you more information on this if you need it from my presentation. I think that could be really helpful to have a little more of the detail because it's quite a lot to follow. So here are the figures. Yeah, this is the right graph so that we're staying here together. The data shows overall that the challenge to allocate adequate, sustained, and flexible funding to the implementation of women, peace, and security and humanitarian action commitments, it really is a high challenge at this point. We need to think about how we can refer to using this compact on women, peace, and security and really draw out the ability to take a more strategic opportunity to push the agenda on women, peace, and security forward together. One of the objectives of the working group is to renew commitments in the following agreed targets. So can we together galvanize the donor community to allocate a minimum level of ODA at 15% to the principal objective of working on gender equality in fragile contexts? And could the remaining 85% include gender equality as well as a significant objective? Over the next decade, achieving a 5-fold increase in direct assistance to local organizations. Currently, women's organizations in institutional fragile contexts receive $190 million worth of aid, which represents only 1%. Again, this is not enough. UN entities should really try to think about earmarking 15% of peace building funds, 15% of funds for countering violent extremism to programs that advance gender equality as a principal objective. And non-donor countries and crisis-affected countries as well should better integrate gender equality into their partnerships with donor countries and international financial institutions when seeking financing or aid. So I think we really can see that there's a call here with the compact to make greater commitments, and we want to be able to assist you with that as we advance. I think we can probably take the slides down for just a second. And I wanted to add that we do have quite a few publications in this area and in other areas, and we're happy to provide more information. And I wanted to emphasize that within the Development Assistance Committee, there's a process underway to develop more effective guidance about what it is to be fit to be a development agency that really can work on the gender equality issues more effectively. And we will touch again on what I had mentioned previously, which is that we will think about institutional arrangements and how it is that some countries are doing better than others in making those investments, and what are the things that are different about the ways that their institutions are set up, their policy frameworks are set up, what makes it easier for them, or what can we do to improve the options going forward. So I hope this has been helpful, and I'll stop now. I think I've used my 12 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I really appreciate the clear call for earmarking, and let's set aside and be very explicit and intentional about the level of resources that we need to reach these organizations, and lots of incredible research and resources to support. So Mindy, I would like to invite you to come in. You're also going to be speaking to some of the data or what we're seeing, but from a bit of a different perspective, not official development assistance, but based on a survey that you all have done with women and girl-led organizations. Tell us more about that.
Great, thanks, Cindy. It's such a pleasure to be here with everyone today. Just a quick moment on Voice. Voice is really working to accelerate a global revolution against systemic violence powered by women and girls in the organizations they lead. We're really working to transform the humanitarian aid industry that we know has been notorious for excluding women and girls from its priority setting and program delivery. So we did a survey late last year to really look at how are women-led organizations faring in relation to COVID? So the report is called We Must Do Better. We launched it last week, and it's really a global feminist assessment of the experiences of women and girls and the organizations that they lead. It looks at their lives holistically to see how the pandemic has impacted their organizations. It reached created a platform for over 200 feminist organizations and individual women activists across 41 countries and 6 regions. And they really gave them the opportunity to share how the pandemic has been affecting them. It speaks to their needs, the things that they've been promised that haven't been delivered on. We gave them an opportunity to talk about their frustrations and how those frustrations might be alleviated. The research really recognizes the dual aspects of women's lives, that women in leadership are not living outside the dynamics they are trying to change, that they're often situated much like the women that they're aiming to serve. 84% of the participating groups were described themselves as being women-led, and also working on some form of violence against women and girls. Over 35% of the responding organizations had noted that they'd received under 5,000 or just under 10,000 in 2020. So they really weren't faring better in relation to fundraising related to COVID. The majority of them highlighted that they're dependent on INGOs, which is something someone has already been mentioned, right? We know that these organizations still are they're not getting the lion's share of the money at all, and most of that money is going to INGOs still. But these groups that we spoke to were really dependent on those groups. They also then mentioned, reliance on UN donor money, as well as income generation and membership fees equally. So those were really significant things I think we need to understand about how hard it is for these organizations to continue to exist, especially in a crisis like COVID. It really illustrated how this burden or the dependence on women's voluntary or unpaid work in these organizations is so significant. And it kind of mirrors what we're seeing related to the COVID response, right? We know that women are going to do more. They often do more with less. We know that they're the majority of frontline responders, but these efforts aren't recognized, they're not valued the way that they should be, and they're not resourced. We've seen this time and time again, emergency after emergency, and even though we knew that we forecasted that violence against women and girls was going to be exacerbated, in August of last year, the Global Humanitarian Response Plan only accounted for 0.48% of the overall fund for violence against women and girls. So that that tiny bit of money was coming in for violence against women and girls, but we knew all along that we were going to see major increases. The respondents from the survey really talked about how the sort of burden of all of the work that they had to take on, whether it was in the home or outside of the home, really broke down their capacity to run their organizations, right? They were losing staff, they didn't have the personal protective gear that they needed to continue to meet the needs. They had increased case loads, but they weren't getting new resources to respond to those case loads. the fact that they were dependent on membership fees meant that they were losing money because women could no longer pay those membership fees. That's one of the first things that would go out the window when they were needing to meet the needs of their household. Some organizations did report that they had sort of found supportive donors, that donors were trying to adjust their processes to make them more flexible. But I would say the vast majority of the organizations that we spoke to really had not been able to find supportive donors. They talked about how donors had reduced their funding calls or they canceled their grant making processes. They noted difficulties in getting funds transferred. Bank closures was a significant thing that many organizations noted that donors might not necessarily think about. A year into the pandemic, many of the organizations noted that they were still waiting to hear about funding decisions. Half of the respondents had not received any additional funding to help them respond. Over 70% of the organizations noted that they had not received any of the new funding, or they were still just waiting to hear what donors were going to decide. When we asked the organizations what kind of funding support they needed, the vast majority of respondents noted that they wanted to build relationships. They wanted support in engaging in advocacy. They wanted to make connections. They needed a bridge build to help them access the donors and be part of the conversation. The women noted that they've historically been sidelined from emergency-related decision-making. They've been excluded from the halls of power. So why would the COVID response be any different? They noted that they needed help getting into those spaces and that their double burden of all of the care that they have to provide keeps them from those spaces as well. Women don't have the luxury that men might have in terms of accessing decision-making rooms. They noted that they still, they wanted to be able to access money that was not hard to manage. They wanted the resources to be easier to use. They wanted their systems to be acknowledged as powerful and not be asked to change their systems in order to accommodate donor needs, right? So, which I think is a really significant thing. In additional research that we've done around this, many donors have told us, yes, it's a priority. We want to get funding to women-led organizations, but our systems will never accommodate them. They won't be able to manage the accountability practices that we have. And so I think one of the biggest things out of this research is that we have to figure out how to adapt our systems, come up with more flexible ways to get resources into the hands of women-led organizations. We have to trust them. We have to meet them where they are with the needs that they're trying to respond to, and really make sure that their expertise, they're expert knowers. They know what is needed for their families and communities, and let the relationship with donors be driven from that. Let that be the beginning entry point, and don't sort of institutionalize them and make them something that they didn't intend to be because of donor priorities. So I think I'll wrap up there. Cindy, I'm excited to continue this conversation. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mindy. And I think you touched on a lot of themes that I was also thinking about as we move to this next section, where we want to focus in a little bit more on what is it when we talk about institutional funding? How do we understand that, and why is it important? And I'm going to echo many of the themes that you raised. So we've heard a bit from Lisa about the overall landscape of funding that's out there for women's rights in fragile contexts, that there's a trend that's growing or moving in the right direction, but it's not enough. I already see someone in the chat box saying, well, wait a minute, why a target of 15%? And where is that coming from? And maybe we want to be more ambitious in what we look for. But we want to focus in particularly on what kind of funding. So institutional funding is another way of describing general operating support. Some call it core support. It's a grant that's in support of an organization's mission rather than specific projects. So that gives more flexibility that we've already talked about. Ideally, it would be multi-year. And it can be used for sustaining day-to-day operations. That can be paying rent or phone or internet or salaries, professional development and staff learning opportunities, or other organizational strengthening work. And it can also support programmatic work. But its flexibility allows room for changing plans, as long as those changes in plans are about advancing that mission. So it's different from project restricted funding, which at best, some project funding might allow for a percentage of salary to be covered and maybe a small percentage of overhead costs. But let's say a 7% threshold to cover overhead really isn't enough for organizations to sustain themselves. And I also want to be explicit about what institutional support is not. It's not anything goes. It's not carte blanche. So we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the lessons and address that concern that you can't see results if you provide institutional support. You absolutely can, but it's about what kinds of results are we looking at. We can show how we're driving toward our mission. And I want to add just a little bit of my own data into this conversation. But again, very much echoing what we heard from Mendy, that these kinds of flexible resources that are really oriented towards institutional support often don't directly reach women's rights organizations. So from a survey that AWID did of over 700 organizations around the world, half of them had never received any core flexible support before. And so I just want to emphasize that it's not always about more funding. We know there are budget constraints or limitations, but making better use of the resources that we do have is key. How are we putting that intention and support into practice? It's one thing if the intention is to subcontract a group to do exactly what a funder institution thinks makes sense. But it's something else to really invest in the people who are working to address the problems that are directly affecting their lives and communities. And so here I want to pause and we're going to shift to a video to hear from some of the local women's rights organizations that have received this kind of support or are hoping to receive it, to learn more about what institutional support means for them.
النسائية وذلك لبناء قدرات الموظفين لتنفيذ مشاريع مستدامة في حماية المرأة عالية الجودة وفي مختلف فتح الفرص الجديدة وبناء شراكات مع منظمات محلية ودولية وتساهم في تقديم خدمات متميزة في حماية المرأة والطفل ورفع قدرات الكادر النسائي في مجال المشاريع وتنمية وتمكين المرأة.
It strengthens the institution. For instance, the funding that has been received from WPHF has been able to give us office space, has been able to give us salary, internet, and also facilities like Zoom, which has enabled us to conduct our meetings virtually. And in that case, we've been able to do effectively our work.
Lip service is given most of the time to the main gender issues. As a result, most women and vulnerable groups rely on local women organizations to flag their cases and advocate on their behalf. That is why institutional funding is so important for local women's organizations to enable them stay alive. Stay alive means having support for the recruitment and retention of qualified staff, support rental costs, mobility, and more others. AFL is one of the beneficiaries of institutional funding.
Nous avons une expérience mitigée parce que nous n'avons pas assez d'opportunités pour accéder au financement institutionnel. D'abord par le fait que nous sommes au niveau local, nous évoluons au niveau local, mais aussi nous évoluons à l'intérieur du pays, c'est-à-dire en province. Ce qui fait qu'on n'a pas assez d'informations relatives aux opportunités qui peuvent nous permettre d'accéder à un financement institutionnel. Et s'il faut parler de l'appui institutionnel, que plusieurs opportunités, quand nous faisons des recherches sur Internet, sont en langue anglaise. Et donc, en tant que citoyenne des pays francophones, nous avons du mal effectivement à pouvoir soumettre ou candidater à différents appels à projets à cause de la langue.
And these are some of the challenges below. I have 3 here. A, funding limited offered to staff salary. So when they staff the staff salary, and then number B, letter B is B, limited indirect cost support given to the organization. And C is complicated procedures set by the partners.
We as a local woman-led organization, we are facing a lot of challenges. One of the challenges we have is proposal writing. We also have a challenge of funding, since we got the funding, but it's our first funding and it's small. Limited institutional funds becomes a big challenge to us due to the sustainability of our staff, and also not having access to internet sometimes is also a challenge to us due to the limited institutional funds, because without the internet we cannot access bigger programs that are online.
Compte tenu de la pandémie, le montant que le MOFEDGA va recevoir sera utilisé pour acheter des matériels informatiques et téléphoniques en vue de travailler à distance, louer un local suffisamment spacieux et aéré pour fonctionner en toute sécurité quand le télétravail n'est pas possible. Acheter des matériels de bureau afin que nous puissions recevoir nos partenaires, nos membres et les victimes de VBG dignement. Payer le personnel administratif et technique pour de meilleurs résultats visibles et mesurables.
Our current funding really has been helpful to us, and I must say that we've been able to pay for our office space, to get equipment, to pay for internet, and we are very grateful because we've also built capacity of our member organizations. They're able to use to have skills like using Zoom, Google Meet, and they've been able to work online. And with this COVID, it has been helpful because we've been able to do work. It has sustained us. So we think that this institutional funding is very effective, especially reaching down on the grassroots.
Institutional funding will be of great help to us. Hence, the capacity building for the staff and Chico team management will help us a lot, because it will have acquiring of the knowledge from the staff. E.g., in case we have somebody who is taught on proposal writing, this person will help us a lot. Instead of us hiring now a consultant, we'll have already somebody who is doing it for us.
Great. So I'm interested what you all heard in that about why institutional funding matters. Something that really stood out to me when I was talking about the organizers of the session, about the impetus behind it. They said that when surveying their grantees about the impacts of the pandemic, one of the questions was, do you feel your organization's existence is at risk? And about a third responded in the affirmative. And so what I hear in that video, and what I hear when I think about a third of the organizations who are not sure if they're going to be able to continue to function, speaks overwhelmingly to the importance of this kind of support. Because if I'm cobbling together 3 or 4 different project funding to sustain the organization, I might not be able to hire full-time staff. So I'm not building that capacity in an ongoing way. The bulk of my attention is going to fundraising. It's not going to programmatic strategy. I'm probably feeling pretty dispersed because, you know, a few years ago, there would be talk about the Christmas tree effect, where you're kind of hanging on all of these different project threads. And I'm not able to think proactively about how to respond to a shifting context. And I know folks in the chat have been making the point that especially in a context of crisis and pandemic, flexibility is critical. And even beyond that crisis, we still need to be able to be responsive to the shifts. So project funding might make sense in contexts that don't change very much. But for addressing complex social problems, responding to crisis, you really want your partner to be agile and responsive. And I think there's been already some significant recognition in all of the speakers so far of the important role that local women's organizations, and I want to shout out here, I know there was a comment, it's not just about the organizations, it's associations, it's different kinds of groups that are coming together to work on these issues. They are really the key driver of the change that we want to see for gender equality and peace. And yet we hear time and time again, I heard it from what Mindy shared from the Voice research. I heard it in being part of a working group for a recent research initiative that was facilitated by the Women's Refugee Commission. And they collected over 100 stories about responses to crisis and forced displacement. Again, the insights shouldn't be rocket science, that the positive experiences really center local women's leadership and engagement. The negative experiences are most often when the affected community can't access information or they're not participating in decision-making, or when it seems that donors are setting the humanitarian agenda. And so I want to go back to the GenderNet report that Lisa alluded to that came out in 2016 on donor support to Southern women's rights organizations, because this has also come up in our chat thread. The majority of aid is supporting the international NGOs or CSOs that are based in the donor country. And this is in 2014, only 8% of gender-focused aid to civil society went to civil society organizations in the global South. So that's really the dynamic that we want to change. If you want to support these organizations, the local women's rights organizations, because you believe the evidence that they drive positive change, then the funding mechanisms need to reflect that, and we need to fund them like we want them to win. AWID and Mama Cash a few months ago put out research on funding modalities that make clear that there really are ways to move resources, including flexible institutional support, to local women's organizations based in the global South. It may be that the EU cannot always directly fund women's rights organizations, but they can fund intermediaries that do reach them, women's funds, feminist funds. So I'm tagging this, I expect Natalie is going to come back and speak from Urgent Action Fund's experience as well. There are many examples that it's possible. And although our next speakers are going to focus on some different multilateral funds and the amazing experience that they have had, I just really want to emphasize that they're not alone. I want everyone who's a funder to feel a lot of peer pressure here. And I want to add a few anecdotes that aren't at the table that reflect the extensive research done within private philanthropy on why institutional funding, general operating support is important. The Astrea Foundation recently launched feminist funding principles, and core support is a critical pillar within those principles. Again, they believe it enables their grantee partners to self-determine agendas, to respond to changes in context and seize opportunities and put the funds where they're most needed. The Ford Foundation launched a whole program, their BUILD program, that's based on the premise that social justice organizations face well-funded and well-organized opposition, yet often lack flexible funding or reserves to innovate, learn, take risks, And let me emphasize this last part, develop their work for the long haul. We're in it for a long haul. So we can't just be supporting projects here and there. So without further on that, let me shift to hearing about some of these really exciting, promising mechanisms to channel institutional funding to women's organizations. So Erin, it sounds like Spotlight was able to make some amazing headway in a really difficult context. Can't wait to hear more about it.
Great. Cindy, thank you so much. And I'll just start with the caveat that we are really proud of what we were able to do in the context of COVID, but we have a long way to go. And I'm really grateful for the chat that's already happening and for the insights already provided, because it really helps us within the UN system learn and grow as well. So just wanted to start with that. My name is Erin Kenny. I head up the technical unit of the Spotlight Initiative Secretariat. The Spotlight Initiative is a partnership of the European Union and the United Nations to eliminate violence against women and girls worldwide. It was started in September of 2017 and is currently operational in 31 country and regional programs across 5 regions, with deep and comprehensive investments that look at all the different ways that violence manifests and all the different spaces in society where people need to take action to mitigate and address violence. Importantly, we have a really deep commitment to and investment in civil society across all of our programs and within our governance. We've set targets for ourselves within all of our programs of 50% of all Spotlight funds to go to civil society, with 80% of that target going to grassroots and national women's rights organizations. And I am happy to say that in our last annual report, we showed that we had actually exceeded those targets. Hopefully, we'll see the trend continue for the next report. We heard from Lisa that only 1% of gender-focused aid from governments goes to autonomous women's organizations in fragile contexts. In times of COVID-19, when misogyny, hate speech, and rates of violence against women and girls are increasing, women's organizations and activists are facing further threats to their survival. We've heard this as well, and it's been clear in the chat too. This is unacceptable, and it's also, frankly, completely unnecessary. I'll give you one hopefully positive example from Spotlight, and I look forward to hearing from Aldiana and Rita as well to do a deeper dive. What we saw when COVID-19 hit was an opportunity to finally push for this flexibility in funding that would potentially otherwise have not been on the table. We were really grateful to the European Union. I know Henriette said that they're not usually very flexible. They've been abundantly flexible with the Spotlight Initiative, and we could not be more grateful to that. They were really open to us working with all of our country teams to quickly pivot and redirect funding where it was needed most. And that included to just the institutional survival of our women's rights and other civil society partners on the ground. This meant not only programmatically were we able to shift to focus on very specific prevention interventions to look at mitigating intimate partner violence, but also to make sure that our frontline service providers were protected, had PPE, and that government and civil society partners had the necessary resources to work remotely. This included kind of high-speed internet and anything else they needed to facilitate their essential work. To date, we've pivoted about $21 million in Spotlight Initiative funds that could go to these revamped efforts, to the prevention and service provision, and to the remote working. Also, really gratefully, Aldiana and the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women had done this survey right away to see what partners needed. And based on the outcomes of that survey, we came together to redirect over $9 million of funds to their grantees. Henriette mentioned this, in sub-Saharan Africa, just for institutional funding. And with Rita and her team at the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, we added new funding streams for institutional funding in Papua New Guinea, Afghanistan, and Haiti. And you saw some of those partners in the video as well. We also gave our partners full freedom to redirect their budgets, including away from the committed program activities to really whatever they needed to use the funds for, and gave them abundant flexibility to do that. Within all of this, we did this based on the direction provided by our civil society partner, in consultation with them and really listening to their feedback and their needs. But I say all this with a lot of humility and a deep desire to change, because we recognize the UN system still has a long way to go in financing the drivers of change. As Spotlight Initiative is the first fund to model the United Nations Development System reform, we are fully committed to shifting the way feminist movements are funded within the UN system. What this looks like to us so far, and we're still learning, is if core funding is about funding to strengthen an organization to deliver its objectives more effectively, then the grant-making processes should have this aim in mind from the application process. We need to simplify and reframe calls for proposals and revisit eligibility and reporting requirements from a perspective of listening and learning. Second, we must fund from the point of trust. And I think Mendy mentioned this as well. This involves sharing decision-making power and letting local organizations set the agenda and funding priorities. Third, we have to invest more intentionally in a portfolio of small grants that can direct institutional funding for national and local women's organizations without any programmatic requirements. And finally, as allies of feminist movements, we can and should pursue our internal advocacy work amongst the international donor community to shift the larger funding ecosystem and contribute to move the money to the frontline actors of transformational and sustainable change. As allies, we should also systematically create avenues for civil society members to voice their needs and inputs to guide and help define the way forward. COVID-19 is giving us an opportunity to reimagine and revisit the status quo. We cannot afford to go back. Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you so much, Erin. Aldiana, I would love to call you in to add on that some opportunities that were kind of catalyzed through the pandemic, but I know you all at the Trust Fund were already thinking about how to expand your core support even before the crisis really kicked off.
Thank you so much, Cindy, and what a pleasure and honor to be in this amazing group of activists around the world today. I want to start by building on Erin's point about we cannot go back. And you know, as we now see the light at the end of the tunnel, you know, all around me, I hear every day the sentence, one specific sentence, but I cannot wait to go back to normal. And of course, in terms of personal and professional life, I totally understand what does that mean, and neither can I. But you know, however, when COVID came, when it comes to violence against women and girls, normal was actually a problem. And I do not want us to go back to that normal. You know, normality of violence against women and normality of lack of services, normality of investment in civil society, women's rights organizations and women-led organizations, you know, like a huge lack of funding. You know, and we all know that also COVID is going to stay for quite a while because lack of vaccine in a developing world. You know, we're all excited about vaccine, but vaccine is not going to be distributed evenly around the world. So we are going to have this situation and crisis for a long time. And unfortunately, just the way the life is, you know, today is a COVID, and you know, there's something, might be other crises. You know, we've seen it with Ebola, what happens, particularly in violence against women, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I think we must be prepared much better, and we must be, you know, our response needs to be ready, not just for COVID, but for every day, you know, especially when it comes to violence against women. You know, to quote Henrietta, who said, Ms. Geiger, who says, more relevant than ever, you know, it is now, this need for institutional funding. But I want to quote two speakers from opening of the CSW, two young women, Renata Eck from Brazil, who said, we must begin now to disrupt status quo. And Ms. Koch Alvarengue, who says, do not take this opportunity for granted, and we must all do, we must do our best not to waste it. And I think that is basically where I want to start really this. So in terms of the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women, we have spent 25 years of learning, and we will probably spend another hundreds of years of learning. I hope not hundreds, maybe less, because I hope we will eradicate the issue earlier and work ourselves out of the job. But as some of speakers already mentioned, we were well positioned, given great work of our partners on the ground, to very quickly learn from them what is the situation on the ground, what is happening. And therefore, we were really focused immediately to supporting and enabling grantees, and their project activities to shift their budgets, to invest in a core, to move the budgets for really basic response to COVID. And we are very grateful to our own donors, including EU UN Spotlight Initiative, who, as it was mentioned, directed $9 million for 44 grantees in sub-Saharan Africa. But for all of our 144 grantees, we have done the same. We've enacted five-point action plan that helped them deal with the crisis. But this is as we call it in Trust Fund, Band-Aid. This is not solution. This is just response. And solution has to be much more long-term and has to be structured, has to be ongoing, and has to be sustainable. In a few weeks' time, we will be announcing $15 million to civil society, women's rights organizations for specifically, again, work in the context of COVID. But we will also go into the future continue to strongly advocate that the spotlight is on the lived realities of women and girls. We know that they know what they're doing on the ground. We know what the issues are. And for the urgent need to continue directing flexible resources to grassroots civil society actors, women's organizations, and women-led organizations. The one thing I really want to raise today and actually try and do is debunk the myth. There's this huge myth, while we all have a strong consensus that the work of small women-led women rights organizations and CSOs, particularly in Global South, is basically, amazing work, and it's providing all that needs for the response and for the prevention of violence against women. There's this huge, long-standing myth that women rights organizations cannot manage long pots of funding. And, we have, recorded and we have evidence to show that's absolutely not the case. Of course, there has to be the context in which those resources, high resources, are given, and there has to be frameworks in which you ensure that there's a capacity development included with that to support. I've heard in a video some organizations, and we have the same from our grantees, who are saying, they cannot write funding proposals. They struggle with that. So some of this granting has to be accompanied with the capacity building, with ensuring that they receive support in terms of building capacity to do their audits, so that they can have a clean audits and build the institutions so they can apply for other grants in the next generation of funding. For example, our midterm review concluded that UN Trust Fund should absolutely continue to capitalize on the unique niche of funding small women's rights organizations. And we will continue to do that. We are about beginning of April to release our new strategic plan, 2021-2025. And I'm very happy to kind of give you a little preview today by saying that over those 5 years, we will be aiming to increase the core funding to 21% by the end of the strategic plan. And that also our grants will be increased from potentially 3 years that we are funding right now, and we will already increase that from 2 to 3 years, because we learned that sustainability cannot be achieved in 2 or 3 years. We will be shifting it to the maximum of 6 years for grant giving. And we are also will be looking at the giving grants specifically for the institutions, for what we call institutional grants. So I think what the time is, and hearing all the speakers, and I really don't want to also repeat what Erin said, because I think she's probably looked, I swear we haven't shared the notes, but she has said everything that, we have I also wanted to say. But I think this is really great, because we see that we are learning across UN system. We are complex institutions. But, you know, as Ms. Geiger said as well, you know, EU, but UN as well, very complex institution. But it is clear that we are learning in this process, that we are hearing, not just listening, but also hearing. And as activists within institutions, we are adjusting and trying to make it responsive to the needs on the ground. So I think finally, as a group that is working on these issues, all of us together as a partners, we just simply must recognize and agree that CSOs needs flexible funding to organize, operate, adapt, and to build their resilience. And therefore, we have heard one very important word that is in my notes as well. We must be intentional in flexible funding. That is simply now the new normal. That is normal, to be intentional with the flexible funding by providing the frameworks. We have seen in our work, as I said earlier, that when we intentionally allocate flexible resources, we have our grantees reporting from the last year of their work within the COVID environment, great successes. Even while they were adjusting, adapting their projects, they were taking care of their families and their staff and their beneficiaries, they still managed to actually achieve amazing results. And I believe that this is just like building a house that we have to agree. It's a very simple metaphor. You know, if you want a house to stand alone at all times, you have to build foundations. You have to invest resources in foundations and supporting walls as they hold the house. So I think, you know, for me, the key words are intentionality of the resourcing, core resourcing, and debunking the myths that women's rights organizations, small organizations cannot handle their large resources. But, you know, that they can, and we need to just provide them with the frameworks and context in which they can actually thrive and achieve what they aim to achieve. Back to you, Cindy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Adriana. And now we want to learn a little bit more about some of the lessons from institutional funding. Geeta, you're going to speak from the perspective of the experience of the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund.
Yes, thank you so much, Cindy. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Rita Al-Khiyari. I'm the head of the Secretariat of the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. It's great to have you all today. So the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund is a partnership between the United Nations and civil society. We are a pretty new mechanism that was launched in 2016 and is dedicated exclusively to supporting women's organizations in fragile settings, so peace and security, humanitarian work. We have supported over 330 civil society organizations so far across 23 countries. So for us, the issue of flexible funding was at the heart of our mandate when we were starting, just thinking about what it means concretely to operate in peace and security, conflict-affected humanitarian crisis context, and how does it affect the way that we should work with our partners and with civil society organizations. So from the very beginning, we had the idea of flexibility of the funding at the heart of the way we operate with our partners, which means that we didn't have any kind of maximum amount to be allocated to general operating costs, things like that. But we did not have a dedicated institutional funding stream until 2020, which is why I also second what Erin was saying about the necessity for us to be humble in our approach, because we're only just starting and being able to implement this kind of support. But just to say also that for us in peace and security and humanitarian contexts, similarly to other contexts as well, but even more in those contexts, civil society organizations are not just there to deliver on projects. That's not their only value, right? Because their own existence and their very existence contributes to peace and security and to stability. So it's not just through the projects and how they serve the community, which of course is important, but the fact that they're there, that they exist, that we have women rights organizations that widen the democratic space, that ensure accountability from the government, that are there to kind of ensure that human rights are respected when a country is being rebuilt. That's actually as such contributing to the stability and peace and security of a country as a whole. So we had to kind of also take into consideration these two dimensions of the added value of women's organizations in these contexts. But when I was saying that we were not able to do actual funding that only goes to general operating costs, as you were saying, until the COVID-19 pandemic hit. So I'm not going to say that it was an opportunity, although it has helped us. And thanks also to the flexibility of our donors, to the EU UN Spotlight Initiative, but also to all of our 16 donors and board members, we were able to establish this new mechanism that looks only at supporting general operating costs and institutional funding for women's organizations. So we moved from a model where we had this flexibility in the funding to a model where we offered specific windows of funding for women's organizations to apply only for institutional funding. Why we did that? Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic. The lessons learned, it's good to be flexible, but also we have noticed that there is a lot of self-censorship. Organizations are so used that they cannot request too much budget for their operating costs, that there is self-censorship. So to Sagand, Aldiana, and Erin, there needs to be an intentionality into like telling the organizations, this is for you to operate, and it's okay not to be used for project-based activities. And then you were mentioning our survey earlier, Cindy. When the pandemic hit in March, we surveyed very quickly our partners too, and 30% of them told us that they were at risk of disappearing. And unfortunately, we repeated the survey a few weeks ago, and now it has gone up to 44% of our partners who now are, expressing this fear that they won't be able to make it through the pandemic. And those are partners that are already receiving funding from a large UN managed fund. So we don't even I can't imagine what it must be for others as well. And we get a very good idea from the survey that was presented by Menti as well earlier. So we kind of institutionalized that type of support now through the the COVID-19 window that we have through our partnership with the EU and the UN, and also another partnership that we have with the German corporation on forced displacement. So we were able to support 21 projects only for institutional funding, but also to allow all of our partners to redirect some of their funding to institutional support. And we have much more coming now because we have calls for proposals that are open at the moment and are offering this type of support. So when we were doing this, we were asking ourselves two main questions. How can we make it accessible to as many organizations as possible? And we've heard a lot from the video that was played earlier on the actual prerequisites for accessibility in terms of language, the application process, how simplified has been, to reiterate also to women's organizations that it's okay again to apply not for project-based activities, because I think there's like a trauma about being kind of sidelined or not selected if you just come with a project that really looks at just making your organization stronger, which is what we're looking for. And beyond the application process, obviously, and this was mentioned before, how the reporting requirements are also a little bit not as heavy as for larger project-based programs. And the other questions, I was talking about accessibility, the other question that we were also thinking, because that's also one of our donors' requirement that we need also to take into account. How do we measure impact? As you said, Cindy, earlier, it's different types of results, but there are results, and there are longer term results as well into supporting a very simple project that looks at just supporting the operating costs of an organization. So we try to kind of come up with some indicators and metrics that were actually taken from the applications. So we didn't make it up. We just looked at what people were putting on the table, and we just kind of drew some lessons and some good things that we could actually use and report on. So it can be the number of months that the organizations can sustain themselves for. It could be what are the adaptive strategies or tools or systems that the organization has adopted and implemented. How much money was raised from this initial funding to institutional support, but also longer term effects. We also see that sometimes organizations want to fund stuff for advocacy, for mobilizations, for coalition building. This does not require very large resources, and sometimes organizations don't want to externalize and outsource these things. They want it to be internalized, and sometimes it doesn't require a lot of budget, but it has a very long-term effects. I'm from Morocco, and I always remember an example from an organization that was advocating for the change of the reform of the family law. And it really struck me how they always said that it cost them $15,000 to change the family law, just because that was the salary of 3 people for some months that were actually drafting the advocacy papers and doing all of the work around it. So sometimes the longer term effects of that support is really huge, and we can see and demonstrate, I think, for donors as well, the value for money on this type of funding. I'll stop here. Thanks, Cindy.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Gitas. Very important insights and learnings that we can carry forward. And we're going to build on that a little bit more, focusing really more on the recommendations. How can the donor community increase funding, and particularly institutional funding? I know we are running short on our time. So if folks have questions, please do put those in the chat. We'll do our best to cover them as we go forward. We're going to segue to another short video, and then I will pass over to our speakers. First.
If you give one organization, you can actually reach out to many more people. So I recommend that funding should be given to human rights organizations who then they also can benefit others on the grassroots. I also say that when you give out institutional funding, you increase women's choices and freedom to be able to influence, to be able to control, to be able to participate in activities. So I think that institutional funding is very important and should be provided by the donors.
I request the donor community to at least build and trust local women-led organizations. I also request donor community to at least reduce on the administrative burden, e.g. being flexible with them and also telling them or guiding them on what to do as women-led organizations. And then also, I request the donor community to at least to give opportunity to women-led organizations at least to prioritize their own gender equality.
Le MOFEDGA recommande à la communauté des donateurs de pencher sur la situation des organisations de femmes qui travaillent dans des conditions très difficiles pour pallier aux problèmes de discrimination et de la violence faite à l'égard des femmes et des filles. Et du même coup, nous demandons aux donateurs de faire confiance aux organisations de femmes locales et d'être plus flexibles dans leur financement institutionnel.
We need to work together and support each other in ending the violence against women and girls.
We recommend a stronger partnership with local women's organizations should be pursued with the view of assessing the institutional capacity to help build them through staff secondment or special project to support institutional capacity strengthening. This should be a long-term effort, at least 5 years.
Faites confiance aux organisations locales de femmes parce qu'elles sont gérées par les victimes elles-mêmes, les femmes qui vivent les atrocités, les femmes qui ont vécu les violences sexuelles, et donc elles sont en mesure d'apporter des solutions valables et des solutions durables. Faites confiance aux organisations féminines, appuyez-les, appuyez-les.
So trust is another big theme that I hear in that video and that several of our speakers have mentioned. Natalie, how do you see the way forward? What do you think donors can be doing more?
Thank you so much, Cindy. We have heard from our speakers today and from the video we just watched what is happening, what we need to do, even some great examples of how we're already doing it from Spotlight, the WPHF, the UNTF. I also want to highlight the excellent recent report by Mama Cash and Awade on how funders can resource feminist movements. I can share it in the chat. So why is it still not happening? Or rather, why is it still not happening enough? And how can we do better? How can the donor community support local women's organizations with the type of abundant, flexible, predictable, and sustainable funding they need to thrive? So first, I want to acknowledge the progress that has been made and the important shifts that are happening in the philanthropic sector. There is a growing commitment, and we've heard it again and again, to adopt explicitly feminist and decolonial approaches to funding, and that's a big deal. That means we need to repoliticize our work. We're facing daunting crises that everyone has named extensively, and we must not be afraid to own that our project for feminist liberation is an unapologetically political one. We need to reflect on who has wealth and power and why, and where that wealth comes from. So this means our role is also wealth redistribution and reparations. We need to clarify who we're funding. It's not just local women's groups, but local feminist groups. It's not just organizations, but social movements. We need to adopt an intersectional and holistic approach. This means we fund across movements. We prioritize those facing multiple forms of discrimination and with the least funding. This is how we leave no one behind. We support movements holistically. It was great to hear Lisa's overview of OECD data. It would be useful to put this data in perspective of other funding, for instance, defense funding versus investment in women's leadership and peace processes, or tax break for corporations compared to impunity for violence against environmental defenders. So let's look at it holistically. Are we centering the leadership of movements? Are we ensuring there's an enabling environment so that they are safe and can continue to do their work? And are they being funded generously, directly, and flexibly? Those are all interconnected. Local feminist movements, they're not just facing an existential threat because they have a lack of funding, they're also directly attacked. Their labor is exploited, their needs and well-being are deprioritized. This is systemic violence and exclusion. So as many have already pointed out here, we as donors also need to engage in advocacy. Of course, we need to do it mindfully, always in solidarity with and at the service of movements, but we do need to use our voice to push for accountability and for structural change. So what does this mean and how can we put it in practice? Number one, we need to rethink accountability, recognize the ways in which we're still holding on to power. For us as donors, it's an honor to act as allies at the service of movements for justice. We are the ones who have to be accountable to movements, not the reverse. So we need to move from what is still an enduring charity mindset to a justice approach. Nobody needs to be saved here, least of all women. And in the words of Vanessa Daniel from Groundswell Fund, this is not just about giving grants, it's about giving control of wealth. So movements need to be engaged as equal partners and make decisions on how processes are structured, on requirements at all levels, and concretely, this means that establishing participatory grant making or community or civil society advisory mechanisms is an important first steps. And we need to make sure they have the mandate, the information, and the resources to participate in decisions in a truly meaningful way. We need to rethink capacity building. We need to recognize how we're sometimes causing harm, as many have pointed out, draining energy, time, and resources away from essential movement work with our requirements. We need to build our own capacity. Let's not kill political liberation with log frames. I hear it's great that we're going to sometimes build the capacity of activists to fill out our log frames, but why do we even need log frames? And concretely, sharing power means sharing labor. That means, moving money where it's not, prioritizing funding to community-based organizations that are part of intersectional feminist movements, revising our own requirements internally so we can fund unregistered informal activism, and do our research, offer unrestricted funds to groups that we know are doing great work. Mackenzie Scott has done it beautifully and abundantly. We heard from one of the videos we watched today that writing a proposal can be a challenge and an obstacle. The ability to write a proposal in the specific language that we require it usually has nothing to do with the ability to organize your community or effectively provide services. We can just call our grantees and fill out applications or reports with them or for them. as many have said, we need to directly fund local groups when possible, and this is usually possible. And we're always happy at UAF to share our experiences, or we can do it indirectly. But about indirect funding and intermediaries, we need to be clear about the criteria. There needs to be long-term, deep partnerships that are based on mutual trust, power sharing, and again, a shared political project that is driven by movements, not donors. And finally, we need to rethink risk. We hear a lot about due diligence and mitigating risk, and we need to reframe what we understand as risk and look at the big picture. The question is not, what's the risk if we fund this local group? What is the risk if we don't fund them? The risk is not about financial audits or absorption, it's about fascism. I feel like I'm on my soapbox here, but it's about fascism. Rita highlighted CSOs are not just there to deliver on results. It's not about them like proving to us that they're doing good. We know they're doing good. They're essential. Aldiana, you talked about debunking the myth that they can manage large pots of funding. Of course they can. If they have more money, they can manage more money. We all can. Also, what's the risk of tying our own hands? We need to revisit our own barriers that we've imposed on ourselves. As Erin has eloquently put it, it's both unacceptable and completely unnecessary. And as you said, Cindy, very possible to change it. So to do things, to fund movements in ways that are not extractive or directive, that don't drain them or increase competition around them, that means encouraging consortiums, coalitions, movement building, operating from an abundance model. And I don't want to give airtime to anti-rights movement. They've largely co-opted progressive movements, language, and strategies, but I just want to remind us that they have really generous and flexible funding. I also, the risk is also of rushing and focusing on a narrow and flawed idea of what it means to deliver results. We really need to shift our pace. As many have said, the grantees themselves move at the speed of trust. So finally, the courage of women, trans, and gender nonconforming defenders calls us to show courage in what, who, and how we fund. This is about righting wrongs. We need to unlearn the perfectionism that makes us afraid of making mistakes, and have courageous, humble conversations like these where we learn together. And I'm hopeful because I firmly believe that deeply transformative changes are possible even within traditional institutions and structures.
Thank you so much, Natalie. There was overwhelming support and interest in your points in the chat box, so I think they resonated a lot. Krista, please come and join us. I realize we are getting down to the wire on time. Just a reminder, our interpreters don't want us to speed up the pace of our speaking. So really keen to hear from Global Affairs Canada.
Great. Thank you so much, Cindy, and a very warm good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today. Before I start, I'd really like to thank Cindy for moderating today's really important event. And most importantly, to the local women's organizations whose voice we heard, which are absolutely critical to the discussion. And to me, the greatest takeaways, I think Natalie really hit on in her last talk, where the trust, the issue of intentionality, these are all things that I'm definitely taking away from today's discussion. And I think that the new data that Rita just shared with us, that 44% of WPHF civil society partners now believe their organization's existence, their very existence is at risk because of the COVID pandemic, is truly alarming. So I'll be speaking today from a donor's perspective, a very proud donor, but nonetheless a donor. And I think, we've heard some great speakers this morning, so I am mindful of the time, so I'll try and keep my comments to a minimum. But just to highlight that Canada does believe very strongly that continued funding for local women's organizations in this pandemic must continue, and it's critical for their future recovery. We've had multiple discussions with women's organizations over the last year, and we've heard time and time and again that need for flexible, multi-year programmatic funding and institutional funding, which is critical for the sustainable impact and support. So I thought I would take just a few minutes to give you some remarks from a donor's perspective on how Canada has been listening, hearing, and actively working to address some of the shortfalls. So Canada has committed to a feminist international assistance policy, and through its National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, to increase the participation of women and youth and women's organization and networks in conflict prevention, in conflict resolution, and peace building. And this policy is at its very heart about changing those systems and practices that perpetuate inequality and inequity, and is helping ensure that political commitments absolutely translate into concrete funding decisions. And this change has been achieved in a couple different ways. So I thought I would just highlight some exciting ways that Canada has been working to achieve this. So in 2018, so now it's almost 3 years old, but Canada provided $300 million to establish the Equality Fund in order to build a new global funding mechanism and leverage more resources for gender equality. And the goal of that fund is really to create a long-term and self-sustaining source of funding for women's rights organizations and movements, shifting that critical power to women's rights organizations and ensuring more money gets into the hands of women, girls, and non-binary people globally. And because support to women at the grassroots level is key to sustainable peace, Canada announced a series of new investments to mark the 20th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, in recognition that despite the passing of 20 years, women and women's organizations continue to lack sustainable funding. In addition to our ongoing nearly $10 million in support of women peace builders globally and human rights defenders, we also announced a $5 million envelope solely dedicated to supporting women's grassroots local organizations working in peace building. And this includes technical support, it includes protection, it includes multi-year funding, all those things that we've been hearing that are critical to the sustainability of a lot of these women's organizations. And of course, Canada is a proud supporter of the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, and we provided over $7 million to the fund since 2016, and we are a proud board member in 2021. So this is really just a very small snapshot of how Canada is tangibly addressing some of the chronic lack of support to women's organizations, but it's clearly not enough. And so, we call upon our fellow donors to help match some of those excellent graphs that Lisa was highlighting at the beginning of the talk today. And the reality is donor governments, and I'm speaking from Canada's perspective only, but donor governments will always be confronted by shifting political priorities and shifting demands and limited resources. But there's always room to think more creatively, more collaboratively, and incorporating more innovation. And this should result in increased institutional supports to women's organizations. And as a donor, Canada, we are looking critically at how the structure of our own programming and agreements can allow for greater flexibility to directly support women's organizations. We continually assess that programming to ensure it is meeting the needs of women's organizations. And most importantly, we want to work with all of you to ensure that financing the crucial work that women's rights organizations and women peace builders do can continue in spite of and despite the current pandemic landscape. We are but one brick needed in that house that several people alluded to, but we see ourselves as nonetheless a small but vital, important brick in that overall house. You can continue to count on Canada to support local women's organizations, and we really do thank the WPHF and the Spotlight Initiative for highlighting the critical need for institutional support. And just to echo the other comment on unpaid work, that's something that we've really engaged a lot of our partners with to get a better handle on how much that is overall. And so I'd be curious to continue that conversation at some point as well. But just a huge thank you to the organizers. Thank you to the women who participated today in the videos, and thank you to my colleagues as well.
Thank you so much, Krista. Every brick certainly does count in this process, so we very much appreciate hearing from you. I'm asking for the indulgence of our audience. We're stretching 5 minutes to be able to hear from Päivi from UN Women some closing remarks. And thank you all again for the great conversation today.
Thank you so much, Cindy, and thank you for bearing with me. And obviously, I am
going to be here repeating the things that have been said today. First, Cindy, thank you indeed so much for moderating this excellent discussion. So I'm going to summarize some of the points I've heard, and I think it's been really inspiring, this discussion. I want to say it is clear that institutional funding is needed, and with evidence showing that funding is not enough being allocated to local women's organizations and gender equality. And evidence also showing that the impact of this lack of funding threatens local women's organizations' existence and functioning. And when we take note of the environments where they operate, this is even more challenging. And we heard how women's rights groups and movements are a crucial antidote to regressive forces that are pushing back gender equality and peace gains. Yes, might be seen as political in many contexts. And we heard that the survey done by WPHF, 76% of CSO respondents have some level of resistance or retaliation against women's rights or women's organizations. So we've heard many times here today how investing in local women's organizations is an essential brick to building a bridge for peace and gender equality. And women's rights organizations are pioneers in designing effective and innovative approaches and advance gender equality. They are on the front lines and strategically placed, and should I say also, women's organizations and women's rights organizations are everywhere. They are in places the United Nations or even militaries can't reach sometimes. So they are there where the work needs to be done. We heard from women from Yemen, Liberia, Uganda, DRC, PNG, South Sudan, Haiti, but this type of funding is about staying alive, but also investing in building local capacity for increased quality of impact, increased reach, increased access to funding for more sustainability and influence. And we heard how existing UN funds have adapted and integrated institutional funding and more flexibility to ensure greater accessibility and respond to the needs on the ground. I should say also we heard how donors have adapted and shown flexibility to meet this need, and really grateful that this is happening. So this conversation has also brought up the challenges in accessing, managing, and evaluating this type of funding, but also reminded us to ensure a demand-driven process, not to burden some on local organizations. It would be actually contradictory to the whole purpose of this funding, allowing women and women's organizations focus on their mission and their advocacy. There are still challenges, and we've heard about this. We really need to rethink these processes to integrate institutional funding for local women's organizations as an essential brick to building peace and investing in gender equality. And I want to reiterate what we are often discussing. Imagine a world where women's organizations and women's rights organizations would not be able to operate at all. None of us wants that world. We should be very scared of such a world. Let's not let it happen. So looking forward to continued collaboration and discussion how we can ensure there are also viable, active women's organizations who can implement their own goals in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists, to all of our participants for the active participation. We will be continuing this conversation, I have no doubt, in many venues, and special thanks to the Spotlight Initiative and Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund for their leadership in organizing the session. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day and evening.